So one day I wondered, what if I make a moon model composed of all the layers of the moon? It would be pretty cool to make a literal scale model of the moon. So I told myself, why not? How big would the model be? Well, I chose 6 inches because it's half a foot and it would be easy to calculate later on. Now, according to NASA, the moon is 2,160 miles in diameter. Now we had to figure out 6 inches times what equals 2,160 miles. Now we had to do some math. I used this multiplication strategy called a matrix table to multiply 2,160 times 10,560, with the 2,160 miles being the diameter of the moon. Then I needed to figure out what 1 inch equaled, and that would need 2,160 divided by 6, and that equals 360 miles. You might not know this, but the moon has 4 distinct layers, those being the crust, the mantle, the outer core, and the inner core. Now I needed to figure out the widths of them for my scale model. So now what do I do? Well, I went through the NASA page, and once I got the numbers, I started typing them into my computer for the crust, the mantle, the inner core, and the outer core. Then I created a trace diagram on paper, but how would I trace the circle? That is where the 3D printer would come in. First, I would have to make a 3D model. First, I'd have to make a circle, then size it up, then cut it into pieces to make sure it was small enough to actually print, and then get it into 4 pieces to make a circle. And I realized it would take 3 hours to print, but it was well worth it in the end. Whilst that was printing, I went back to my tracing diagram where I would add stuff to it, including color the whole thing in, and cutting it down to its necessary form. Then I took the 4 pieces off the 3D printer, arranged them into a circle, the 4 pieces, and then, of course, I needed to tape them to get them together. Then, once I had it taped, I put it on the tracing diagram, and then I measured it to make sure it was 6 inches, which it was, on both sides. And I checked it on both sides, and it was. So now, it was time to make the actual model. I got Play-Doh, and I made the inner core out of white Play-Doh and the outer core out of orange Play-Doh. Now, to make the mantle, I took a piece of paper and started coloring it completely to make it gray, because the mantle of the moon is gray. Then, I started marking some points on the paper to cut a circle out. As soon as that was done, I made a strip to connect it to that side of the mantle, so there weren't any gaps showing the red connector piece. Then I put it on, and then I taped it. Now I had to make a paper semisphere, but I was ready. I needed a piece of paper, a ruler, a pencil, some crayons, and all of the above. Before all that, we had to get the crust. Once that temporary crust was finished, I started plotting a point in the middle of the red connector piece on the side that was still visible. Then, after that, I started cutting up paper strips for the semisphere of the moon model. Then I started attaching them to 2 Play-Doh cans. Then I taped them to make sure they attached to the Play-Doh containers. And I kept copying this process over and over again until I got a workable semisphere. Once I got the essential structure down, made up of 8 to 10 strips, I started adding additional ones to make sure it was completely strong as it could be. Then, of course, I added some other parts to make it more smooth. As you can see, it's pretty durable, on the top at least. And then I added some tape to make sure that a ton of ridges weren't showing when I would eventually paint it. So, once I got that completely done, I started adding another strip down here so the Scotch tape wouldn't be exposed, because we would also be painting that. Then I went to paint it all gray, which didn't take that much time. It took about 3 to 5 minutes. And then I was done with that. Then I knew that the moon did have some extra details, like mirrors on the surface, which were ancient lava lakes. But they dried out, and now they left dark gray lake shapes. So then I added in those details, and after that, I had the finished product for the moon semisphere part. After the events of adding the whole semicircle part, the crust looked bad, so I added a brand new crust, and I attached it with clear tape this time, and eventually I had my completely finished moon model. Now I just needed to measure it up to make sure it was up to par. It was according to the tracer model, but I just measured it with a ruler just in case. That was one side, then I did the second side. Measured the inner core, which was about 1 inch, followed by the outer core, which was supposed to be 1/3 of an inch, and yes, it was. The mantle was 2 inches, so I checked that, and the crust was 1/12 of an inch. Then I took a 3D printed part from one of my scraps from the robot shelf that I had, created a stand out of Legos, covered up with paper, then added some extra supports and a little sign that showed you the model and its layers, and that is the model.